The room went silent when William pushed the folder back across the table. Not slammed it, not thrown it, just pushed it back. And somehow, that was worse. Because sitting opposite him were people who had spent years believing one thing was already settled. A privilege Charles had supposedly assured them would remain untouched: access, protection, a place inside the royal machinery that ordinary relatives could never dream of having. Then William said 6 words. "It doesn't continue under my authority." Nobody answered. But one member of Camilla's family apparently reached for the folder so quickly that the papers inside shifted across the polished table. Because this wasn't about losing an invitation. It wasn't about Christmas at Sandringham. It wasn't even about a title. It was about something they had quietly begun treating as permanent. And William had just told them it never was. What they didn't know yet was that the worst part wasn't the privilege William was taking away. It was the reason he decided to take it away now. Because somewhere inside the paperwork was a detail Charles apparently never expected his son to challenge. And once William saw it, the conversation changed completely. To understand why Camilla's family would panic over one sentence from William, you have to understand what they thought Charles had given them. Not publicly. That would have been too easy. Nothing written across the palace gates. No proclamation. No grand ceremony. Something far more valuable. Continuity. The quiet assumption that certain doors would stay open. That access granted during Charles's reign wouldn't simply disappear when William became king. That family members connected to Camilla would remain close enough to the royal household to benefit from arrangements, invitations, residences, security considerations, ceremonial access, or private use of royal spaces that had gradually become familiar. Familiar is the dangerous word. Because when people receive something long enough, they stop calling it a privilege. They start calling it theirs. And according to this dramatized palace scenario, that was exactly the mistake William had been waiting for. The first warning supposedly came during a routine review. Nothing dramatic. A list, names, properties, access permissions, household arrangements. One aide expected William to sign off on the continuation without much discussion. Instead, William circled one entry, then another, then looked up. Who approved these? The aide gave him the answer everyone expected. The king, Charles. That should have ended it. It didn't. William asked another question. For how long? And suddenly nobody wanted to answer. See the problem? Approval is one thing. Permanent entitlement is something else entirely. William wanted to know whether these arrangements belonged to Charles personally, to the crown institutionally, or to the individuals benefiting from them. 3 very different things. The answer reportedly wasn't comfortable. Because several of the privileges being treated as long-term guarantees depended almost entirely on the reigning monarch continuing to approve them. Meaning Charles could promise access while Charles was king. But Charles couldn't necessarily bind William forever. And when that distinction reached Camilla's side of the family, panic started quietly. A phone call first, then another. Then, somebody reportedly asked whether William had actually been shown the original correspondence. Not the summaries, the originals. That question should tell you everything. Because people rarely fear paperwork unless the wording matters. And here, the wording mattered enormously. One phrase apparently appeared again and again. At His Majesty's discretion. Sounds harmless, almost ceremonial. But discretion has an expiration date. The moment the person exercising it is no longer the person in charge. Which meant Camilla's relatives may have believed Charles had built them a bridge into William's reign. William saw something else. A bridge that ended the second Charles stepped off it. But then came the twist. William wasn't actually planning to remove everything. Not at first. He was apparently prepared to leave some arrangements alone, quietly. No humiliation, no confrontation, no spectacle. Then somebody made a mistake. A big one. A member of Camilla's circle allegedly began speaking as though the continuation had already been guaranteed. Not requested, guaranteed. That word got back to William. And according to the dramatized version of events, his reaction wasn't anger. It was colder. Guaranteed by whom? You can almost feel the temperature change, because suddenly this wasn't merely about access. It was about authority. Someone had apparently assumed Charles's promise could reach beyond Charles himself. William didn't like the implication. But what happened next turned a private disagreement into something much bigger. William asked his team to review every arrangement connected to the Queen's extended family that could survive beyond the present reign. Every one. Not because he wanted revenge, because he wanted a line. Royal, private, institutional, personal. Where exactly did one end and the other begin? And that's when another name entered the conversation. Anne. Now imagine you're Camilla. You're hearing William is reviewing privileges your family thought were secure. Then you learn Princess Anne has been asked for her view on historical precedent. That is not the person you want walking into this argument. Because Anne doesn't care whether something feels awkward. She cares whether it belongs there. According to the dramatized account, Anne looked at one of the arrangements and asked a brutally simple question. Was this granted to the Queen or to her relatives? Nobody answered immediately. Anne didn't need them to. Because if the privilege existed because Camilla was queen, that didn't automatically transform Camilla's relatives into permanent royal beneficiaries, and William knew it. But Camilla knew something William didn't. Charles had apparently made a personal assurance years earlier, not a casual remark over dinner. Something more deliberate, something Camilla believed would settle the matter. She had kept it, and when William's review reached a certain point, she produced it. That should have stopped him. Instead, it made things worse. The assurance was apparently warm, personal, definite. Charles wanted Camilla to know that people important to her would continue to be treated with consideration. There were references to stability, respect, family, future continuity. But there was one thing missing: authority over the next reign. Charles had written what he wanted. He hadn't written what William must do. That distinction landed like a brick. Because Camilla didn't need proof Charles cared. Everybody knew Charles cared. She needed proof William was bound, and there wasn't any. At least, not in the document William was shown. Now here's where the story takes a nasty turn. One of the privileges under review allegedly wasn't symbolic at all. It involved access to a royal property during periods when senior working royals weren't using it. Not ownership. That matters. Nobody was handing over a palace. But access itself carries enormous value. Privacy, prestige, security, proximity. The kind of thing you never appreciate until someone tells you the gate code no longer works. And William reportedly wanted that privilege ended first. Why that one? Because of what had happened months earlier. A guest had apparently been brought into a restricted area under the assumption that being attached to Camilla's family was enough. Nothing catastrophic happened, no security breach that shook the monarchy, but William learned about it. And what bothered him wasn't the guest. It was the assumption. Nobody had asked. They believed they didn't need to. That was the moment William apparently decided the arrangement had crossed an invisible line. A privilege had started behaving like a right, and William hates blurred lines when they involve the institution he expects to inherit. That's when the family meeting was called. No press, no grand palace showdown. A closed room, small table, 3 folders. William arrived with an advisor. Camilla's side expected negotiation. William brought a decision. That difference became obvious almost immediately. One family member reportedly tried to soften the conversation. We were told this would remain unchanged. William asked, "By my father?" "Yes." William nodded. Then came the sentence. My father can speak for his reign. There it was. Everything else had just become secondary, because William wasn't accusing Charles of deception. He was doing something far more difficult. He was limiting Charles's reach, not as a son, as the future sovereign. And halfway through this story, if you're thinking, there's no way this ends with just one canceled privilege, you're already seeing where this is going. Subscribe if you enjoy these palace power struggles, because the next detail is where Camilla's family apparently realized William wasn't reviewing one arrangement. He was creating a rule. That's what frightened them. Rules spread. If William could say one privilege was personal to Charles's reign, what else could be reconsidered? Guest access, household invitations, travel arrangements, ceremonial seating, private use of estates, informal security support, the little invisible things nobody outside palace walls notices. One by one, they suddenly looked vulnerable. Camilla reportedly contacted Charles. Of course she did. And this is where you'd expect the king to put his foot down. He'd made the assurances. His wife was angry. Her family felt blindsided. Surely Charles would simply tell William to stop. Apparently he tried something subtler. He asked William not to make the matter personal. Bad choice of words. Because William's entire argument was that it already was personal. Personal promises, personal relationships, personal discretion. He wanted institutional clarity. Charles wanted family peace. Those goals collided. William reportedly told him, "I'm trying to prevent the next reign inheriting arrangements it never approved." Read that again. He wasn't talking about now. He was talking about later, which meant the real confrontation wasn't William versus Camilla's family. It was William versus Charles's idea of what family loyalty should survive the crown. And Charles apparently pushed back. Harder this time. He reminded William that Camilla had endured years of hostility, that her relatives had often been dragged into attention they never asked for, that offering them some comfort, access, and protection wasn't corruption. It was kindness. William didn't dispute that. But then he asked the question Charles couldn't easily answer. Where does kindness become inheritance? Silence. Because that's the trap. Charles could defend helping them. Much harder to defend permanently obligating the next monarch to continue doing it. But Camilla wasn't finished. She reportedly argued that withdrawing the privilege would look vindictive. People would interpret it as William targeting her children, punishing her family, drawing a line between real royals and everyone connected to her. William understood the optics. Then he did something she didn't expect. He agreed. Yes, that is how it could look. For a second, Camilla thought she'd won. Then William added that the solution wasn't to preserve the privilege. The solution was to strip personal names from the policy completely. No Camilla, no Parker Bowles, no specific family, a general rule. Non-working relatives of a consort would no longer receive automatic continuation of special access into a new reign. There it was. Not a punishment, a precedent, which was much harder to fight, because now opposing William meant asking for a permanent exception, and exceptions look ugly when written down. But remember that folder William pushed across the table? We haven't reached the worst page yet. The family believed it contained the final decision. It didn't. Buried underneath was a second document, a transition protocol. That's when the panic became real. Because William wasn't simply canceling an existing privilege, he was preventing a future one from activating. Something Charles had apparently discussed but never formally completed. A more permanent arrangement involving continued use of a particular royal residence after his reign. Not ownership, not inheritance. A right of use under specific circumstances. Camilla's family thought Charles's intention was enough. William's review concluded it wasn't. And because the arrangement hadn't been finalized, William could stop it before it ever became active. That's the privilege in the title. Not something being ripped out of someone's hands. something they thought was already waiting for them. William was shutting the door before they reached it. One relative reportedly said, "But His Majesty promised." William looked directly at them. "I know. Just 2 words. No denial, no excuse." That's what made it brutal. He wasn't saying Charles never promised it. He was saying the promise wasn't Charles's to guarantee. Think about what that means inside a family. Charles may have spoken as a father, a husband, a king trying to protect the people closest to his wife. William was answering as the man who knows every promise made today could become his obligation tomorrow. Neither side had to be evil. That's what makes it nastier. Both could believe they were right, but only one of them would eventually control the next reign. Then Anne walked in, not literally at the dramatic last second, but her written opinion reached the meeting. And according to this dramatized account, it was devastatingly brief. Future sovereigns should not inherit discretionary family commitments unless those commitments had been formally vested. That was it. Clinical, cold, almost impossible to argue with. Camilla hated it. Not because Anne attacked her. Anne didn't. Because Anne removed emotion from the equation. Charles's promise became just that. A promise. Not a binding royal obligation. But then William made one concession. And nobody saw it coming. He said existing privileges would not end immediately. There would be a transition period. Private access already scheduled could continue. Existing invitations would be honored. Nobody would be publicly embarrassed. No dramatic eviction. No locked gates tomorrow morning. Camilla's family relaxed. Too early. Because William's concession had an expiry date. After that date, every privilege would require fresh approval. His approval. That's the part that changed everything. They hadn't simply lost Charles's promise. They had become dependent on William's discretion, the exact person they were furious with. And suddenly the hierarchy inside that room was impossible to ignore. For years, Camilla's family had existed near the monarchy, through Charles. Charles's affection gave them a kind of invisible shield. William was telling them that shield stopped with Charles, not because he hated them, because they were not the crown. And then came the personal blow. Camilla reportedly confronted William privately afterward. No advisors, no folders, just the two of them. She asked whether he would have made the same decision if the people involved were Catherine's relatives. William apparently didn't answer immediately. Dangerous question. Because the Middletons have faced similar public scrutiny about proximity to royalty. William could hardly claim family connections didn't matter when his own in-laws were part of the future king's family. Camilla thought she had him. Then William answered, yes. 1 word. But Camilla pushed. Would Catherine's parents be denied automatic privileges under a future reign? William's answer was reportedly the same. If something belonged to him personally, he could offer it personally. If it belonged to the institution, it needed institutional justification. That didn't calm Camilla. It terrified her more. Because it meant William wasn't improvising. He had thought this through. This wasn't revenge. It was architecture. He was designing the boundaries of his reign before it began. And Charles suddenly realized something uncomfortable. Every private arrangement he created now was teaching William what he wanted to dismantle later. That's when the argument stopped being about Camilla. It became about Charles's legacy. How much of his reign would survive him? How many choices could William reverse? How many promises would quietly expire the moment the crown changed heads? Nobody wanted to say it aloud, but everybody in that room understood the answer. More than Charles wanted to admit. And Camilla's family? They understood something even colder. They had spent years believing their security came from being close to the king. But proximity to one monarch does not equal protection from the next. The final decision reportedly arrived in a plain envelope. No royal drama, no red seal. No devastating proclamation, just revised terms. Access remained temporary. Future residence rights were removed. Continuation was subject to the next sovereign's approval. No hereditary expectation. No automatic transfer. No special category for the consort's relatives. Charles read it. Camilla read it. William had already approved it. And there, at the bottom, was the part nobody could argue with. Nothing had been taken away from Camilla herself. Her position was untouched. Her dignity protected. Her family hadn't been publicly expelled. William had done something more precise. He'd separated the Queen from the Queen's relatives. One remained royal, the others remained family, and those were no longer the same thing. But here's the image that apparently stayed with one person who knew about the meeting. After everyone left, the original assurance from Charles was still lying on the table. The paper Camilla had believed would settle everything. William picked it up, read the final lines again, then placed it inside the folder marked personal. Not crown, personal. That single word was the entire battle, because Charles could promise them almost anything while the crown was his, but he could not promise them William. And if you think that line between family and crown is going to matter only once, look closely at what happens next inside this family. Because the next royal promise William examines may belong to someone far closer to him. Subscribe, because when that door opens, this argument is going to look small.